What's up, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. Today's the second episode of Making Sense of the End Times. In the first episode of this series, I left off by talking about how the Romans, following the Third Jewish Revolt or war against them between the years 132 to 136 AD, in the aftermath of the war, renamed the country of Judea, which in Latin means land of the Jews, to Palestine, which means land of the Philistines. And ever since, the detractors and enemies of the Jews, along with some, let's say, people who innocently are unaware of the meaning of the term, have referred to the land of Israel as Palestine, for the very same reason that the Romans did in 136 AD, which is to divorce the Jewish history from the country. It's that simple. A form of replacement. And this is a great way to begin this episode with the very theme of replacement. For in this episode, I'm going to refer to the replacement theologies of Christianity and later Islam, which I probably won't be able to cover in this particular video, vis-a-vis the Jews. You can't understand the end times without examining this particular subject, the replacement theologies of both Christianity and Islam vis-a-vis the Jews. Now, of course, most of you are Christian supporters of Israel and will immediately protest and say, Steve, I don't believe that Israel's been replaced at all. And I know that, as I've said elsewhere. Of course, I'm aware that today evangelical Christians, for the most part, are the best friends that the Jewish people have in the world and unconditional supporters of Israel based on their faith as Christians. But I still need to address this phenomenon of the historical church, because it really is the main theme and disposition of Christianity towards the Jews up until and following the Holocaust. It was really the Holocaust and the rebirth of Israel in 1948 that brought much of Christianity to do what's called in Hebrew a hashbon nefesh, a self-examination to see maybe what went wrong in the last couple thousand years, that the worst tragedy to ever befall the Jewish people befell it in the heartland of Martin Luther's Reformation. Okay, the Holocaust happened in the heartland of the Protestant Reformation. It was not just a Catholic phenomenon, anti-Semitism, but church anti-Semitism also plagued Protestantism. It still plagues some of those mainline Protestant churches. And again, you can't understand the end times and why so much of the Western world is so negatively predisposed towards the Jews without understanding the history of Christian replacement theology. Now, when I say replacement theology, I'm referring basically to the belief that the church has replaced Israel in God's covenants with the Jewish people. In other words, whenever the Bible refers to the Jews historically, like in, the books of Genesis through Exodus and the books of Samuel, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, it's referring to the literal Jews, the ethnic Jews. Whenever it's referring in the prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, to the Jews in a condemning way, in a way that predicts judgment for national sin, it's referring to the national and ethnic Jews. But whenever those same books of the prophets are referring to the future Israel, to the redeemed Israel, to the restoration of Israel to its land, well, according to replacement theology, that's no longer referring to ethnic Israel, but rather the church. And in those positive verses in the prophets referring to the future redemption of Israel, they're to be taken allegorically and metaphorically only. They're referring to the church, and therefore anytime Israel or the Jews are condemned, well, those are the Jews being condemned, but anytime Israel is being promised a future hope and redemption, that's referring to the church. And only then are the Jews as mentioned in the Bible, is supposed to not be taken literally. That's replacement theology in a nutshell. And I'm just going to get into a little bit, and I really struggled. It's taken me days to make this video because I really could teach a whole semester on this subject. That's the problem with YouTube. YouTube is not the place to get into real depth about anything, but it's really the venue to keep things simple. And I've had to eliminate a ton of things the last few days from outlines of what I wanted to say here, but I do need to briefly touch upon it, because we need to ask briefly, how in the world did we get here? And I can only touch on such a small part of that. There's so much more to say than I'm going to say, but I can't say it I need to keep these videos short, brief, and to the point. But we have to remember, when we read the New Testament is entirely, for the most part, until the book of Acts at least, featuring Jews. And it's a couple, or at least a couple, actually a few groups of Jews. There's Jewish believers in Jesus, there's Jewish rejectors of Jesus, and then there's multiple groups of Jewish believers in Jesus that don't always agree with each other on anything beyond belief in Jesus. Let me explain this, and it's important, and you'll see why in a second. So the first conflict is between Jewish believers in Jesus and the Jewish non-believers in Jesus. And we see in the New Testament that the Jewish non-believers in Jesus tried to be a stumbling block to Jesus himself, and later made trouble or persecuted those Jews that believe in Jesus. And Paul, who started out as Saul, so Saul is the great example of this. Okay, Saul starts out as a persecutor of those Jews that believe in Jesus. Remember, Saul, later to be known as Paul, says of himself, I'm a Pharisee of Pharisees. Okay, Paul was a leading Pharisee from one of the main groups that opposed Jesus. And Paul starts out as somebody who persecutes Jews, Jewish believers in Jesus. And remember that he's standing and witnessing, and he says even holding the cloaks of those that stoned the first martyr of the faith. That's Stephen. Okay, Stephen in the book of Acts, who again was himself a Jew. Okay, so first of all, we see this conflict between Jewish believers in Jesus and Jewish non-believers in Jesus. But the whole cast of characters are Jews. Okay, all these people are Jews. So that's conflict number one. That's very important. Conflict number two in the New Testament is between Jewish believers in Jesus versus other Jewish believers in Jesus. You have Paul, who believes that faith in Jesus is what matters, and all other stuff is basically dead compared to that. It's the new birth in Christ, the born again experience. Okay, being the salvation in Christ that trumps all things, and compared to that, include the Torah included, is really old news, no longer worth the hassle, so to say. Okay, then you have other Jewish believers in Jesus, such as Peter, who we'll get to in a minute, such as James, the brother of Jesus, who still believed in following the Torah and Jewish ritual law. Although they wouldn't negate that faith in Jesus is what matters, they didn't believe the Torah was yet passé. Okay, they still believed in keeping it. And the example of James, the brother of Jesus, he kept it up till the day of his death. We know this from the account of his death as written by Josephus. Okay, so we have conflicts now between Jewish believers in Jesus and Jewish believers in Jesus. You recall the Jerusalem Council of Acts chapter 15 that settles or tries to settle this dispute once and for all, in which Paul goes to Jerusalem, meets with James, the leader of the community in Jerusalem, or one could say the bishop of Jerusalem and its church or congregation at the time, and they work out this dispute. Is it proper for Gentiles? Do the Gentiles who follow Jesus need to keep the Jewish law? And the answer is resoundingly no. That's the conclusion of the Jerusalem Council. Okay, now, still dispute here is where's the law, where's the place of the law in the lives of Jewish believers in Jesus? And throughout the New Testament, this remains in conflict. Okay, in the book of Galatians, we see Peter going to Galatia, or to the churches in Galatia, and refusing to partake in table fellowship with his fellow believers of Gentile background because he's still keeping the law. He's still keeping the dietary regime known in Hebrew as kashrut, and Paul calls him out on it and says, Peter, you're a hypocrite, for you don't even keep the level of rigidity in following that law in your own time back in Jerusalem, and yet now you're trying to impose it upon the Gentiles. You see Peter himself keeping the law. And it's not just in table fellowship, but it's even up to and including the vision he has at Simon the Tanner's house. Okay, if you remember when God has the vision of the blanket coming down from heaven with all the unkosher and unclean foods. Again, you see that Peter is still in that world of the law and the Jewish dietary rules. Again, what's called in Hebrew kashrut, are not totally settled yet in Peter's life. And this dispute becomes more and more vitriolic in the book of Philippians. Paul, who's a jealous shepherd over his Gentile flock, basically says of those Jews, the Jews who still insist on the law being kept, beware of the dogs, beware the mutilators of the flesh, who insist on your circumcision. Okay, again, he's talking to his Gentile flock who's being constantly assailed by a group of people known as Judaizers. Okay, so in Philippians, these people are called dogs. Okay, and mutilators of the flesh. And the last verse I'll mention here for the sake of the context is Revelation chapter 3, verse 9 again. And that word context is so important, and this is why I'm mentioning all this. So just bear with me and you'll understand why I'm mentioning all these Bible verses. In Revelation chapter 3, when John's writing to the 7 churches there in Asia Minor, with today's Turkey, on 2 occasions he refers to a synagogue of Satan. The more powerful one that I see today quoted even on X and Twitter by outright anti-Semites who are using it to say that today's Jews aren't even the Jews is Revelation chapter 3 verse 9 that says, "Behold, I will make those of the synagogue of Satan, those who say they are Jews and they're not." Now, what's going on here in that context? There are Jewish synagogues in each of those 7 cities in what today is Turkey, or what was then in Asia Minor, many of whose members were persecuting those that were believers in each of these cities, okay? And Paul is basically repeating something that Jesus himself said, that a true Jewish person, at least spiritually, let's say the spiritual Jews, as opposed to just those of us who are physical Jews, the spiritual Jews are those that receive the gospel and walk in the full light of biblical revelation, as opposed to the Jews who may be Jews in the physical sense of the word, but are opposed to God's will and God's operating here on earth. In other words, opposed to what God is doing. Okay, but you have to understand the context of all this. And the problem is that all these disputes that I just named in all the scriptures, which feature Jew versus Jew, whether it's Jewish unbeliever versus Jewish believer, or Jewish believer versus Jewish believer, are later, starting in the 2nd century, miscontextualized, 2nd century AD, miscontextualized, so that what started out as an intra-Jewish dispute, a vitriolic intra-Jewish dispute between various Jewish groups, what's now projected on that is a Jewish versus Gentile church. By the 2nd century, what started out as a Jewish sect of followers of Jesus becomes a Gentile, or at least the beginnings of a new Gentile religion in its own right. And when its Gentile followers are reading the New Testament up until this day sometimes, they don't see the disputes as Jew versus Jew, Jewish believer versus Jewish believer, or Jewish believer versus non-believer, but rather is the Jews versus the Gentiles, or the Jews versus the church. The church, in this case, being basically a non-Jewish religion, being attacked, in its view, when it reads the New Testament, by Jews. The Jews are the opposition throughout the New Testament towards believers. The problem is that the Gentile church throughout history has lost sight of the fact that those believers being attacked by the Jews in the New Testament are also Jews. It's a intra-Jewish family dispute in the New Testament, which later is cast in new themes as the Jews versus the church now being from the 2nd century onward, the church that's now looking back at the New Testament and projecting itself as those being persecuted by the Jews, rather than as the Jews who were believers being persecuted by their fellow Jews. Does any of this make any sense? It's very important. That's just the tip of the iceberg of what becomes, or what leads to, replacement theology. What happens is that Christianity at some point becomes so embittered towards the way the Jews presented an opposition to the faith in its early beginnings, as a stumbling block towards Jesus himself, later as a stumbling block to the Christians themselves, played a role in the early persecution of the believers in Jesus. All of that leads to a Christian church with a chip on its shoulder. And that Christian church largely arrives to this theology vis-a-vis the Jews called replacement theology, which is those wicked opposing Jews have now been replaced by the church. That church totally forgets or ignores Paul's own position on this issue in Romans chapters 9 through 11, which says, for the sake of the fathers, the Jewish people are still loved, and more importantly, God's gifts and callings are irrevocable. Once chosen, always chosen. That the Jewish nation is the chosen nation forever. Okay, Paul is so clear about this in Romans chapter 9 through 11, and yet the embittered church forgets or ignores those 3 chapters, 9, 10, and 11 in Romans altogether, and becomes rabidly anti-Jewish. Later, in modern times, rabidly anti-Semitic. Okay? Replacement theology. Oh, and the church has not only replaced Israel, but the church has replaced Jerusalem. The church has replaced the land of Israel. None of these things, Israel, the land of Israel, Jerusalem, are to be taken literally anymore, but only figuratively, for it's all just allegory and metaphor for the glorious, victorious church, victorious over the synagogue, victorious over the Jews. Now, why did I mention all this? Because it's important in the history that I'm about to conclude with, which is this. I left off the last video with the third and final Jewish rebellion against Rome. And I just mentioned at the outset of this video, reminding you that the Romans changed the name of the country from Judea to Palestine. They also cast the Jews out of Jerusalem on pain of death. I mentioned that the weight of the Jewish population now shifts from Jerusalem and Judea to what is now the Galilee. Okay, the Galilee becomes the main point of habitation, or the population of the Jewish people. It shifts from Jerusalem to the Galilee. The Galilee always had Jews, you know this from the New Testament, but now the full weight of the Jewish population of what today is called the land of Israel shifts to the Galilee. And the Galilee remains the focus of the Jewish population until the arrival of Islam. We're about to get to that in just a moment. 300 years go by from that third and final rebellion of the Jews against Rome. Rome converts, at least on its eastern side, the eastern side of the Roman Empire. The capital is now a place called Byzantium, which is also known as Constantinopolis, and thus that part of the Roman world becomes known as the Byzantine Empire. It is now a Christian empire, where Christianity is now the official religion. And this is in the 4th century AD. When I say the 4th century AD, it's referring to the 300s, okay? That's confusing. It was even confusing to me when I was in school. When we say the 4th century, we're referring to the 300s, okay? In the 300s, the Eastern Empire of Rome relocates its capital to Byzantium. Eventually, it converts to Christianity. It names its capital Byzantium after that first Christian emperor, Constantine. Constantinopolis, therefore, becomes a Christian empire, and the Christians continue the regime and rules of the Romans. The Christians continue the policy of forbidding the Jews, on pain of death, from resettling in Jerusalem. The Christians allow the Jews once a year to visit the Mount of Olives, from whence they are able to behold the ruins of Herod's temple and mourn on it. What day are they allowed to do this? When is this once a year? On the 9th of Av, according to the Hebrew calendar. It's on the 9th of Av that the Jewish people commemorate the destruction of our previous two temples, both Solomon's and Herod's. On that day, the Christian Byzantine rulers of Jerusalem allow the Jews to return as far as the Mount of Olives, okay, in other words, to make pilgrimage from the Galilee or elsewhere in the region of the Middle East, okay, to come. They only can come as far as the Mount of Olives, from where they're able to behold the Temple Mount of Herod and all of its destruction. And wait till you see this. Not only did they behold the destruction, but it is said by many pilgrims of the time that had visited Jerusalem that the Christians had turned the site of the temple into a trash dump. Wow, a trash dump. Steve, why in the world did the Christians turn the site of Herod's temple into a trash dump? For the very reason that I just spent the last 15 minutes or so explaining replacement theology. For by this 4th century, replacement theology is so in control and of the Christian church and its theology vis-a-vis the Jews, that it's engendered such disdain for the Jews that if we Jews don't believe, if we're finding it hard to believe that the Christians are right on this issue, that we've been replaced, well, behold, look, God allowed your holy Temple Mount, the holiest site of the Jewish people, to become a trash dump. In other words, it was meant to not just add salt in the wounds of this grand reversal of Jewish fortunes for the past few hundred years, from the destruction of the temple until the 4th century that I'm talking about, but it was also meant as show and tell to show the Jews, look, you've been replaced by us, the church. The holiest site of Christendom is just a few blocks away in what's called the Holy Sepulchre Church. And if you don't believe that that's now the holiest place on earth, well, look, the remains of your Temple Mount are nothing but a trash dump. And what happens is fortunes are about to change again, for in the year 638 AD, the Muslims conquer like a tidal wave that entire region in the Middle East, including what's now called Palestine. And they enter Jerusalem, and wait to hear this, without even a single arrow being shot. The Bishop of Jerusalem, who's the governor of the city, his name is the Bishop Sophronius, and Sophronius simply opens the door, opens the gates to let the barbarian horde come in without even a fight. So weak had the Byzantine Empire become by this point that in 638, the Muslims just steamroll into Palestine, and the the most senior figure of the Christians in the country simply opens the gates and lets them in. And let this be a lesson to all of us in our day in the West, because it's happening again. The barbarians never enter a city until someone from within the city opens the gate for them. And we're seeing, and I'm not going to get too much into this right now, I don't want to change the subject totally, but we're seeing the migration into Europe of millions of people from the same area of the world, that same background. They've just walked into Europe. Nobody's opposing them. While there's many decent individuals from the Middle East who have immigrated to Europe, there's a critical mass of them that aren't so decent, who want to convert Europe to Islam, who want to establish Sharia laws, the law of the land. And who resisted them? Was there a war before these people entered? No, they walked in, and the local Europeans of their own accord feted them in some cases. I remember seeing video footage in Vienna, Austria, of migrant Muslims from the Middle East arriving to Vienna at the city's train station and being fed with rice and candy and celebrations. And little did the Europeans know at that time, although some of them are waking up to the fact that they were admitting into their presence a critical mass of people that don't want to assimilate into the West and who want to convert the West into a different image, from Western values to the values of Muhammad and Islam. But that will be the subject of later videos. It's not the subject of this video. So I'm going to conclude this video with the following story, that in the year 638, as I mentioned, Sophronius opens the gates to the Caliph Omar being the successor to Muhammad, following another Caliph. Caliph means successor in Arabic, also in Hebrew, by the way. That's a word that both languages share in common. Omar succeeded a guy named Abu Bakr. Omar visits Jerusalem as he enters, and the very first place he asks to go to is the Temple Mount. And he's taken on tour by his most senior aide, a guy by the name of Ka'b el-Abhar. Who's Ka'b el-Abhar? Ka'b is a Jewish convert to Islam. And Ka'b says to Omar, the Caliph or successor to Muhammad, Omar, you see that trash dump in the middle of the Temple Mount? That's the site of El-Maqdis Suleiman, which in Arabic means Solomon's temple. And Omar, who believes that Solomon was a prophet, was a Muslim, and that's the theme of the next video, Islam's replacement theology. Omar, who sees Solomon as a Muslim prophet and can't believe that the Christians have turned the site of the Temple Mount into a trash dump, orders the trash to be removed forthright, immediately. And his successor, shortly thereafter, builds a building called the Dome of the Rock, which sits on top of one of those Jewish temples, in this case, Herod's temple, which the Muslims believe was the site of Solomon's temple. I don't want to confuse you right now. Just all you need to know is that the Muslims believe that that was the site of Solomon's temple. And they build the Dome of the Rock in part to sanctify what was the site, in their eyes, of Solomon's temple, which until then was being defiled as a trash dump by Jerusalem's Christian rulers. Okay? And Islam, which in its own right is a replacement theology religion, whereas the Christian church throughout most of its history believes that it replaced the Jews, Islam believes that it came and it's replaced both the Jews and the Christians. And folks, you can't make sense of the end times unless you know of and understand this really well, that Islam believes itself to be the religion, the only religion, and it's come to replace the perverted scriptures, the Bible. Okay, the Quran has come to replace the Bible, which the Jews and the Christians have perverted and changed. The Bible originally was the Quran, according to Islam. All the previous people that preceded Islam, Jesus, King David, Abraham, even Adam and Eve, were Muslims. Islam is the ultimate replacement theology religion, and it believes that it's replaced that other replacement theology religion of Christianity. And that, friends, is the subject of the next episode of the series, Making Sense in the End Times. Now, again, I know many of you are going to protest this whole video perhaps and say, Steve, when you keep referring to Christianity as replacement theology, I don't believe in that. It's because in my Christianity that I support Israel. Well, I know that, but I need to be fair. I'm an historian. I need to be fair and true to history. And the truth is for the most part of the church's history, up until, as I said at the beginning of the video, the Holocaust and the rebirth of the state of Israel, Christianity was overwhelmingly governed by replacement theology. Throughout its history, yes, there's been one or two people here or there, and there's even been pilgrims, the Puritans and the pilgrims who came here to the United States. Some of them believed that the Jews were going to be restored to Israel, just like many of you believe. I know that, but I'm just saying they were the exceptions to the rule. The rule was replacement theology, and only since the rebirth of Israel in 1948, following the Holocaust, has much of evangelical Christianity taken stock of the last century of events and have had to, has had a coming to the truth moment on this issue and said, gee, God is not through with the Jews. And he's not. But you can't understand the end times without understanding the replacement theologies of both Christianity historically and Islam. For the worst tragedy that ever happened to the Jews happened in the heartland of the Christian Reformation in Germany. Why? Largely, a large part of it was because of the history that I just shared with you, or the tip of the iceberg with you. I could teach a whole semester on this. Replacement theology. Anyway, I'm glad I got this video to an end before this crew behind me, which is chopping down and shredding a tree across the street from me and about to make a lot of noise with their tree shredder, gets started. I was in a race to finish this video before this crew behind me gets that shredder up and running in its full operation and makes too much noise for me to continue making any sort of recording. Anyway, folks, I hope you enjoyed this video. Leave comments, leave questions, give it a thumbs up. If you're not a subscriber, please subscribe. It helps the channel get promoted through the YouTube algorithm. This is Steve the Tour Guide signing off. Bye-bye.